Margaret Thompson stood in the pristine marble lobby of Hartwell Industries, clutching her worn leather purse with trembling hands. At 68, she had hoped to find part-time work to supplement her meager social security income. The bills were piling up, and her small apartment's rent had increased again. She had applied for a simple receptionist position, something to keep her busy and help her make ends meet. Her silver hair was neatly combed, and she wore her best dress, a navy blue outfit she'd had for 15 years, but kept in perfect condition. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside with quiet dignity, pressing the button for the executive floor where the interviews were being conducted. The building was impressive, all glass and steel, representing the empire built by 35-year-old CEO Alexander Hartwell. Margaret had read about him in the newspapers, a tech mogul who had revolutionized digital communications and amassed a fortune worth billions. She wondered if he might be related to the Hartwell family she had once known, but dismissed the thought as coincidence. As she waited in the reception area, surrounded by much younger candidates, Margaret felt increasingly self-conscious. The other applicants were scrolling through smartphones and typing on tablets while she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When her name was finally called, she walked into the interview room with as much confidence as she could muster, not knowing that this meeting would change both her life and that of the man who was about to interview her. Alexander Hartwell barely looked up from his phone as Margaret entered the conference room. He was in the middle of a heated discussion with his assistant about a failed acquisition deal, his voice sharp with frustration. When he finally acknowledged her presence, his expression immediately shifted to one of barely concealed annoyance. Margaret sat across from him at the imposing glass table, her application folder neatly placed before her. Alexander glanced at her resume for perhaps 10 seconds before pushing it aside with obvious disdain. His eyes swept over her appearance, the outdated dress, the worn shoes, the laugh lines that spoke of decades of experience, and his judgment was swift and harsh. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "I'm going to be frank with you. This position requires someone who can handle modern technology, work long hours, and represent our company's image. You're clearly too old to work in today's fast-paced environment." Margaret felt the words hit her like physical blows, but she maintained her composure with the grace that had carried her through decades of service to others. She had expected some challenges due to her age, but the brutal directness of his dismissal caught her off guard. Alexander continued, his tone becoming even more callous. "We need young, energetic people who can adapt to change. Someone who understands social media, digital platforms, and can work the hours required. I'm sorry, but you simply don't fit what we're looking for." As he spoke, Margaret studied his face, something familiar stirring in her memory. There was something about his eyes, the way he held his head when he was being stubborn, that reminded her of someone from long ago. As Alexander continued his dismissive speech, Margaret found herself transported back in time. His voice, though deeper now and hardened by years of business dealings, carried an echo of something she remembered. The way he drummed his fingers on the table when impatient, the slight furrow in his brow when concentrating, these gestures awakened memories that had been dormant for decades. She remembered a small boy with those same dark eyes, lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. But that boy had been gentle, scared, and desperately in need of comfort. This man before her seemed to have buried that vulnerable child beneath layers of wealth and power. Margaret's mind wandered to those long nights 30 years ago when she had worked as a pediatric nurse at St. Mary's Children's Hospital. There had been a little boy, maybe 5 years old, who had been brought in with a severe case of pneumonia. His parents had been wealthy, always impeccably dressed, but they seemed more concerned with their social obligations than with sitting by their son's bedside. The child had been alone most of the time, crying for his mother, afraid of the machines and the strange hospital sounds. Margaret had taken it upon herself to provide the comfort his parents couldn't or wouldn't give. She would sit by his bed during her breaks, reading him stories, bringing him small toys from the hospital gift shop with her own money, and singing him to sleep when the nightmares came. The boy's name had been Alexander, and his last name. Margaret's heart began to race as the realization slowly dawned on her. Could this cold, arrogant man really be the same frightened little boy she had once cared for? Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she studied Alexander's features more intently. The years had changed him dramatically. The soft, round face of childhood had been replaced by sharp, angular features, hardened by success and isolation. But those eyes were unmistakable. They were the same dark brown eyes that had looked up at her with such trust and gratitude all those years ago. She remembered how he used to call her Angel Margaret, because she always appeared when he needed comfort most. During his 3-week stay at the hospital, she had become the closest thing to a mother figure he had experienced. His real mother would visit briefly, usually rushing in and out while taking phone calls, more concerned with her charity galas than her sick child. His father rarely appeared at all, always citing important business meetings. Margaret had been the one to hold his hand during scary medical procedures, to distract him with stories and games, to reassure him that everything would be okay. She had even stayed past her shifts to be with him when he was afraid to sleep alone. The boy had recovered completely, and when he was discharged, he had cried and begged her to come home with him. His parents had laughed off his attachment as childish nonsense, but Margaret had seen the genuine love in that little boy's eyes. She had never forgotten him, often wondering how he had grown up and hoping that he had found the love and attention he so desperately needed. Now, sitting across from this successful but seemingly heartless man, she realized with growing sadness that the gentle, loving child she had known had been buried beneath years of emotional neglect and the corrupting influence of wealth and power. Margaret sat quietly for a moment, weighing her options. She could simply accept his dismissal, gather her dignity, and leave without saying anything. It would be the safe choice, the easy path that would avoid any awkwardness or potential humiliation. But as she looked at Alexander, she saw not just the successful billionaire, but the scared little boy who had once needed her so desperately. Perhaps, she thought, he still needed her, even if he didn't realize it. Taking a deep breath, Margaret leaned forward slightly and spoke in the same gentle voice she had used to comfort him decades ago. "Alexander," she said softly, "do you remember a nurse named Margaret who used to read you stories about brave knights and magical kingdoms?" The change in Alexander's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His confident posture faltered, and his hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. The color drained from his face as he stared at her with growing recognition and disbelief. For a moment, the successful CEO disappeared, replaced by the vulnerable child he had once been. Margaret continued, her voice filled with warmth and memory. "You used to have nightmares about monsters hiding in the hospital corridors, and I would sing you a lullaby about a little bird who learned to fly despite his fear." Alexander's hands began to tremble slightly as the memories came flooding back. He remembered the song, remembered the feeling of safety he had experienced only when Margaret was near, remembered how she had been the only person in his young life who had shown him genuine, unconditional care. The transformation in his expression was profound. Years of carefully constructed emotional barriers began to crumble as he confronted the reality of who was sitting across from him. Block 6, the emotional breakdown. Alexander's carefully constructed facade began to crumble as the full weight of recognition hit him. This woman, whom he had just dismissed as too old to work, was the person who had shown him the only genuine kindness he had experienced during his childhood. Margaret watched as his arrogant demeanor dissolved, revealing the pain and loneliness that success had never been able to heal. Tears began to form in Alexander's eyes as he struggled to process this unexpected reunion. He remembered how Margaret had been the only person who had made him feel truly safe and loved during one of the most frightening periods of his young life. She had been his anchor in a world where his parents were too busy to provide the emotional support he desperately needed. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. I can't believe you were there when no one else was." The memories came flooding back with overwhelming intensity. How she had decorated his hospital room with handmade paper stars, how she had smuggled in his favorite cookies from the hospital cafeteria, how she had held him while he cried from homesickness and fear. She had been more of a mother to him during those 3 weeks than his biological mother had been in years. Margaret reached across the table and gently placed her weathered hand over his trembling one, just as she had done so many times when he was a frightened child. "I never forgot you, Alexander," she said softly. "I often wondered what happened to that sweet little boy who used to tell me he wanted to build castles in the clouds." Alexander broke down completely, sobbing with the raw emotion of someone who had kept his feelings buried for decades. In that moment, all his wealth and power meant nothing. He was just a man confronting the painful reality of how far he had strayed from the gentle, hopeful child he had once been. Block 7, the revelation of loneliness. As Alexander composed himself, wiping away tears with the back of his hand, he began to share the painful truth about his life that no newspaper article or business magazine had ever captured. Despite his massive wealth and professional success, he was profoundly lonely. His parents had died in a car accident when he was in college, and he realized with devastating clarity that he had never truly grieved for the relationship he had never had with them. Margaret listened with the same patient compassion she had shown him as a child, while Alexander revealed how his success had become a prison of isolation. He had surrounded himself with employees, business associates, and social climbers, but had no real friends. His romantic relationships had all been shallow affairs, with women who were more interested in his money than in him as a person. He worked 18-hour days, not because he loved the work, but because it was the only way he knew how to avoid confronting his emotional emptiness. "I became everything my parents wanted me to be," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "Successful, powerful, wealthy. But I lost the part of me that you knew, the part that could feel joy, wonder, and genuine connection with others." Margaret's heart broke as she listened to him describe a life that, despite its external trappings of success, was hollow and meaningless. She realized that the little boy who had once dreamed of building castles in the clouds had become a man who had built walls around his heart instead. The irony was not lost on her that he had just dismissed her for being too old, when what he really needed was the wisdom and unconditional love that often came with age and experience. As he spoke, she began to understand that this unexpected encounter was not just coincidence. It was an opportunity for both of them to heal wounds that had been festering for decades. Block 8. The apology and reflection. Alexander looked directly at Margaret, his eyes filled with shame and remorse for his earlier behavior. The contrast between the arrogant man who had dismissed her minutes ago and the vulnerable person sitting before her now was striking. He realized that his cruel words had been directed not just at a job applicant, but at the woman who had been his guardian angel during one of the most difficult periods of his childhood. "Margaret, I am so deeply sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What I said to you was inexcusable. You, of all people, deserved my respect and gratitude, not my cruelty." He paused, struggling to find words adequate to express his regret. "I don't know who I've become. The child you knew would be ashamed of the man I've turned into." Margaret's response was characteristic of the compassionate person she had always been. Rather than expressing anger or seeking an apology, she simply nodded with understanding. "Success can be a double-edged sword, Alexander," she said gently. "It can give us the power to do wonderful things, but it can also isolate us from the very connections that make life meaningful." Alexander began to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He remembered how, after leaving the hospital as a child, he had thrown himself into his studies as a way to cope with his parents' emotional absence. Academic achievement had become his way of seeking approval, and eventually, business success had become his primary source of self-worth. But somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with the empathy, kindness, and wonder that had once defined him. The accumulation of wealth and power had become an addiction, a way to fill the emotional void left by his childhood experiences. Block 9. The life-changing decision. As their conversation continued, Alexander made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. He realized that this reunion was more than just a coincidence. It was an opportunity to reclaim the humanity he had lost and to honor the woman who had shown him what unconditional love looked like. "Margaret," he said, his voice gaining strength and conviction, "I want to offer you a position, but not the one you applied for." He paused, organizing his thoughts carefully. "I want you to be my personal advisor, not for business, but for life. I need someone to help me remember who I used to be and who I could become again. I need someone to teach me how to reconnect with people, how to find meaning beyond profit margins and quarterly reports." Margaret was initially taken aback by the unexpected offer. She had come seeking a simple receptionist job and was now being offered a role that seemed almost too good to be true. But as she looked into Alexander's eyes, she saw the same sincerity and vulnerability that had characterized him as a child. "I don't need someone to manage my calendar or handle my correspondence," Alexander continued. "I have assistants for that. I need someone to help me become the person you once believed I could be. I need someone to help me build those castles in the clouds we used to talk about. But this time, I want them to be filled with purpose and genuine human connection." The offer represented more than just employment. It was an invitation to help heal the wounds that both of them had carried for decades. For Margaret, it was a chance to provide for herself financially while also fulfilling her lifelong calling to care for others. For Alexander, it was an opportunity to reconnect with his authentic self and learn how to use his resources to make a meaningful difference in the world. Block 10. The transformation begins. Margaret accepted Alexander's offer, and within days the changes in both their lives became apparent. Alexander moved Margaret into a comfortable guest house on his estate, not as a servant, but as a trusted advisor and friend. For the first time in decades, his massive, empty mansion began to feel like a home. Margaret's presence brought warmth and humanity to spaces that had previously been cold showcases of wealth. She introduced simple but profound changes to Alexander's daily routine. Instead of eating alone in his formal dining room while reviewing business reports, they began sharing meals together, during which Margaret would ask him about his day, not his business achievements, but how he was feeling, what had brought him joy or frustration, what he had learned about himself. She encouraged him to take walks around his estate's gardens, something he had never done despite owning the property for years. During these walks, they would talk about life, values and dreams, just as they had when he was a child in the hospital. Margaret also helped Alexander reconnect with simple pleasures he had forgotten existed. She taught him to notice the changing seasons, to appreciate the beauty of a sunset, and to find contentment in quiet moments of reflection. These might seem like small changes, but for someone who had been living in a constant state of driven achievement, they were revolutionary. Under Margaret's gentle guidance, Alexander began to see his wealth not as a scorecard of personal worth, but as a tool that could be used to help others. She shared stories of the many elderly people she had known who struggled to make ends meet, of families who couldn't afford medical care, of communities that lacked basic resources. These conversations awakened in Alexander a sense of social responsibility that his business-focused education had never cultivated. Block 11. The ripple effects. As Alexander's personal transformation continued, it began to affect every aspect of his business and personal relationships. Margaret's influence helped him become a more compassionate leader, and his employees quickly noticed the change. He began to take genuine interest in their well-being, implementing policies that supported work-life balance and providing benefits that addressed real human needs rather than just legal requirements. The company's culture began to shift from one of cutthroat competition to one of collaborative purpose. Alexander started using his platform and resources to address societal issues he had previously ignored. Inspired by Margaret's stories and his own renewed sense of empathy, he established programs to help elderly workers find meaningful employment, created scholarships for underprivileged children, and funded healthcare initiatives in underserved communities. His business practices also evolved to reflect his changing values, with the company taking on projects that prioritized social impact alongside profitability. Margaret's influence extended beyond Alexander's professional life to his personal relationships as well. She helped him understand that genuine connections required vulnerability and authenticity, qualities he had suppressed in his pursuit of success. With her encouragement, he began to reach out to old friends from whom he had become estranged, approaching them with humility and a genuine desire to rebuild meaningful relationships. The transformation was not always easy. Alexander sometimes struggled with the ingrained habits of emotional detachment and the fear of vulnerability that had protected him for so long. But Margaret's patient presence and unconditional support provided him with the security he needed to take emotional risks and open his heart to others. The man who had once dismissed someone as too old to work was learning that wisdom, compassion, and life experience were among the most valuable assets anyone could possess. Block 12. The Legacy of Love. 5 years after their reunion, Alexander and Margaret's relationship had evolved into something that transcended any traditional employment arrangement. She had become the mother figure he had always needed, and he had become the son she had never had. Their bond demonstrated the profound truth that love and care could heal even the deepest wounds and transform the hardest hearts. Margaret's simple presence and wisdom had not only changed Alexander's life, but had also created ripple effects that touched thousands of others through his transformed business practices and philanthropic efforts. Alexander had used his wealth to create a foundation focused on supporting elderly workers, ensuring that people like Margaret would never again face discrimination based on age. He had also established mentorship programs that paired successful business leaders with elderly advisors, recognizing that wisdom and experience were invaluable resources that society too often discarded. The Foundation's work became a model for other corporations, demonstrating that businesses could be both profitable and socially responsible. Margaret's health began to decline as she aged, but Alexander ensured that she received the best possible care while maintaining her dignity and independence. When she finally passed away peacefully at the age of 75, Alexander was by her side, holding her hand just as she had once held his. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the transformation she had helped create in Alexander's life and work. In her honor, Alexander had a memorial garden created on his estate with a plaque that read, in memory of Margaret Thompson, who taught us that the greatest wealth is love and the highest success is service to others. The garden became a place of reflection and inspiration, not just for Alexander, but for the many visitors who came to learn about the woman who had shown that it's never too late to change a life, and that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources. Alexander's story became a testament to the power of second chances, the importance of human connection, and the truth that our greatest teachers often come to us in the most humble packages.